presentation, we had the following arguments like mask characters or literal flag or input characters could be set, part of the input mask itself. Basically, the input mask consists of many different combinations of different placeholders. If you present 0 as one of the placeholder, that represents digits from 0 to 9. You put character 9, that means digit or a space, of course. And of course here, the plus or minus sign is not allowed if you put 9. But if you put 0, the plus and minus signs are allowed. So basically you could have negative or positive number. That's the difference between 0 and 9. The pound itself could be digit or a space again, and the entry is not required, versus the 0 itself, that entry is required. In regard to character L, uppercase L, as you see, the letters A through Z can be typed, or question mark. Again, you could have letters but optional values. So you can take a look at this table as a review in regard to working with the input mask and basically go through that. In this example, you could specify 3 letters and 2 digits. Or in this scenario, you could combine these different placeholders together. This is an example of creating a custom display format. The display format itself could be set the way that you can present different values instead of a text. There's a practice in which you're going to work with input mask, and of course you do have that entry part of your lab. You could also create validation rules. Validation rules can be set in a way that by the time someone enters a value, you could check that specific value against your rule, and if it violates it, automatically it prompts you with a validation text. So please pay attention to this video in which demonstrate how to work with the validation rule. Some of the examples of validation rule expressions are listed in this table. You could actually come up with any expressions as you wish in order to validate the information that is being entered within the text itself. In regard to the required property, you could enforce the user to enter a value. That means you don't accept null values. So there's a required property as a type of yes or no that you can set. Also, you could set the default property. The default property lets the user have a value even though they don't have any specific value, but since you don't accept null values, you enter a default value. Most of the time, fields such as a state, if most of your customers coming from the same state that you have designed, for example, your application for, you could just show the default value to be a state, or even country. Most of your customers might reside in the United States, so you put US as a default country code. Otherwise, people might not know the country of the origin of that user, so they might not know the answer and they put null value, but you require a specific value. So somehow you have to put the default value part of the validation rule. In regard to built-in validation, we have like checkboxes. There are some controls were designed with validation embedded within them. By nature, there are validator controls like checkbox. Either you have the option on or off, or option buttons, for example, or we call them as an option group. You cannot have more than one value to be set. For example, as far as the gender goes, you could have either one of the genders. Of course, these days you never know. But as you know, some of the options also could be a combination of different checkboxes. You have, for example, you could be a student at the same time you could be an employee, at the same time you could be, for example, a customer of the same company. Like imagine you're working for Barnes and Nobles. You could be an employee and a buyer at the same time. And you could also be a student in order to get discount. Just as an example. List boxes and combo boxes, of course, are available. Using the list boxes or combo boxes, you could set some of the properties, like setting the limit to list, as we discussed in the previous chapter, in order not to be able to add more values into the combo box or list box in there. Also, you could specify a default control type. Because as you see, you could use controls to limit user input. You could basically specify a particular property to set a certain values in them. In order to define a default control within the form, you could actually open the table that contains the field, click the data type in the column as a text number or yes and no, and then use the lookup tab. For example, if I switch back in here to the access database and go back to the design view of my table in here, I can make sure that this particular field or first name could get its information from another location. If I switch back on the lookup tab, basically I can pick a list box or pick a combo box from this particular location. And also I can link that to a particular table, a value, or a field list from a particular table also. I can actually build that up from another location and specify only get me the first name of that table and associate that with that particular value. Right now, I'm not making any sense because I'm referring that to its own table. But let's go and make this even nicer. Let's go and add this to be a number value, set that to be a primary key, and also I have first name and last name. And also here, city, I make that to be a text. Let's go save this particular table. Here, I'd like to add a new table and call this again design view. Let's go with ID. Once again, this time with number again, and go with the city as a text. What I like to do, I like to have this table to be called city, and then from this table, let's go ahead and open it up. Let's put some values in here, like ID to be 1, city, for example, Irvine, ID to be 2, for example, be Santa Ana, ID to be 3, and for example, be Newport Beach. As just an example. And then go back to the design view of my table and make the city to look up the value, basically, and present it in a combo box from a table. And the row source could come from the city. And basically, I can show only the city information in there. I can actually go and basically execute this to see if it does work or not. Using the query, I can actually run it, and that would be the list that appears. And it says, do you want to save the changes made? I say yes, and automatically, if I go and view this, I save my table again, and by the time I'm setting up the value on the city, you see I can pick up from an existing table. So that way I'm validating the value that I can enter within the record entry of my employees, for example, but I only pick up the list that is available and is coming from a valid cities. So that's another example of the default control lookup tab that I wanted to demonstrate here for you. So you can always refer to another table that has some values, and if it's not inside of that table, you're not going to accept the values. You could also create your own ActiveX control, which is outside of the scope of this class, like in the case of a calendar control. You only accept certain values, like date and time picker, for example. You automatically detect the lunar year, for example, or you detect holidays, for example. You can create a control to do certain things. So how do we do validation by using the code? First of all, you have to understand when to use the code level validation. The main reason for it is flexibility. You can actually, based on a certain condition or based on a particular event procedure, you could actually do the validation. Most of the validating data could be done on before update and exit events, which makes sense. You don't want to change the value unless you validate it. So these two events are the most important events that you have to consider. In order to validate in any of those events, you could use any of the following functions. You could check for availability of a data to begin with. You could use the isNull function. Using the isNull function, you retrieve a Boolean value of true or false. So in this example, you can check to see if the value of a text box is empty. You could do something. Otherwise, you show a message, for example, or vice versa. You could also validate the string. You could check the length of a string character, for example. Let's say the text box, you enter a value, but you want to make sure that the length of that character is a certain number. Like in the case of password, you want to make sure users enter like 10 digits or 10 characters in there. Less than that, you won't even accept it for security reasons. So len function returns the number of characters within a string. As you see, you don't accept any password less than 8 characters. You could also check for a presence of a character. You could check for a particular character within a string by using inString function. As you see, in a string, you start and then you specify the first string and the second one. As you see, the first string is the expression that is searched, and the second string is the string expression that is sought. So this is an example. What you're doing, you're checking for @ in this particular string value. This in a string will basically retrieve the location of the character that you have found the @ in, starting from the first position of the character. So no matter how big or how lengthy the character is, as soon as you find the first @ you return the result of the position of that character. If it's greater than 0, that means, okay, the @ symbol is presented. You could specify left or right manipulation. From the name indicates, you could go left or right of a particular string. How many characters? You specified within the length property. In this example, as you see, you say A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You say the string result left string secret 4. That gives you from left-hand side 1, 2, 3, 4. That retrieves letter D. If you go with like right 1, that gives you what? G. So you could basically go from there and manipulate the value. Also, you could go with mid, which actually is a combination of left and right together. That gives you the middle portion. In this scenario, if you have 99, A1, B2, C3, 99, the mid of this special code, 3 and 4, what are you doing? You start from 1, 2, 3, and you get the 4th character in this way. As you see, the following code illustrates how the mid function can be used to obtain 4 characters from within another string. So 4 characters from the third one. That gives you A1, B2. A1, B2 right over here. You could also remove unwanted spaces using the trim function. The trim function specifies that you don't want to have, for example, any unwanted space. So it just compresses all the characters together. You could do from left, you could do from right. L trim, right trim. There is a video in which it shows and demonstrates the string validation. Please pay attention to it. There are other functions that you can use part of validation. One is numeric. That basically returns the value and check to see if the value that you have entered has a numerical format. And also you could check for the date format by calling the isDate function. So that makes sure that the value that you have entered is a type of a date. It does support the localized data format determined by the regional setting, so you don't have to be worried about different codes in there. By going through all this demonstration, you get into the lab for validation. That takes you about 40 minutes. So basically, after finishing this lab, we can go on to the next.